peace when my fear is crippling. You are true, you are true, even in my wandering. You are joy, you are joy, you're the reason that I sing. You are life, in you death has lost its sting. Amen. You guys can take a seat.
All right. Well, I am not Dr. Stewart, but I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night, so I had to throw that one in there. I just have a few announcements to make before we continue on. One, the security staff has asked me to remind you guys not to park on the street. Two, housekeeping issues. We are going to have our breakout sessions in the afternoon after lunch starting at 1 o'clock in the Hardin Student Center. And so that's going to be across campus, back towards the guard shack. There's a big building. It says New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary on the side of it, on the building itself. That's the Hardin Student Center. All of our breakouts are going to be upstairs in the Student Center. And we have maps of the Student Center so you can find where the classrooms are for your breakout sessions. If you have your program, it'll tell you which session is in which classroom. So get your map, go upstairs, follow some of the signs that are there, and you can find where your session is. Again, you can go to any breakout session that you want to. If one's full, go to another one because you'll have access to it later via the internet. So have fun with it. It's actually one of my favorite things about conferences is just getting to go wherever I want and do whatever I want, which is better than a workshop. Also, I don't know if you've noticed, but we have tables out in the foyer area. We have several groups. Ratio Christi is here. Logos is here. All of our tables, we have a table for where we're doing Philosophia Christi subscriptions. The Institute for Christian Apologetics has several items on sale, and we also have some things on sale for our Greer Herd Forum. Mission Lab, which hosts all of the events that happen in this building, have a table. The Watchman Fellowship, several of our faculty members are on board with the Watchman Fellowship, and their founder is here. And we have several other just some interesting vendors, and we'll have them all week. Feel free to go by. Don't miss it. And also make sure you check each day what tables are there because they're going to be changing with the speakers that come in and out. So don't miss that opportunity. Well, when I was in 10th grade, I had never really heard of apologetics or known anything about it. But my discipleship training class at church decided we would do this study on different religions and different worldviews. And it was called How Now Shall We Live? And it was a study from Chuck Colson and Nancy Pearcey. And it blew me away. Just to look at other religions and see what their worldviews are and to judge the criteria was something that I'd never really thought of before, but it fascinated me. So I would say that I am standing here today because of Nancy Pearcey. And that's who our speaker is today. She's one of the directors of the Apologetic Institute and the Francis Schaeffer Center and professor and scholar at residence at Houston Baptist University. And she's also involved with the Discovery Institute. But she is a prolific speaker and also a prophetic voice in today's heightened political climate, and just a clear thinker and a sobering thinker on issues that Christians need to pay attention to, specifically in the homosexual arena and rights for life and so on. So Nancy Pearcey is going to be our speaker. Let's welcome her today.
Thank you for that introduction. I'll be talking about life and homosexuality and so on tonight, though. That's not for this morning. The political issues are later. This morning I have a different topic. This topic is what really drives my interest in apologetics is seeing young people who lose their faith, like I did when I was in high school. And the most recent account I heard was a woman I was talking to, a mother whose first son, very warm, loving Christian family, he'd gone off to Texas A&M to study psychology. And when he encountered theories like Freud and Skinner and Watson and Maslow, he was blown away. He'd never been prepared for how to respond to these psychological theories. Within a semester, he had decided that Christianity is just an emotional crutch, it's just wish fulfillment, and he had totally abandoned it. Another example, only weeks before that, I met a couple who was in deep grief because their daughter had gone to a conservative Christian college. Very conservative. I'll tell you afterwards the name if you want. It can happen at any Christian college. She was studying English. And even in Christian colleges, many of the professors are so into postmodernism and deconstructionism that within a short time she had lost any sense of truth, including the truth of her own religious upbringing. So this is really the passion I have, is how can we prepare young people for college, graduate school, the workplace, where they're going to encounter specific theories that they need to be prepared for. Often the sort of general apologetics, the cosmological argument and so on, are just not enough. They need to be able to respond to the specific theories in their field as well. Now, the trouble with that, of course, is there's so many of them. How would you ever be able to master arguments for every single theory that's out there, even in your own field? Is there maybe a set of steps or principles that we can use to master to approach any worldview? And I suggest that there is. By the way, this is very personal for me as well, because I became a Christian in college after a trip to L'Abri when Francis Schaeffer was still there in Switzerland. I was going to school in Germany. And when I became a Christian, I felt a responsibility to be able to show why Christianity is true over against all the other worldviews I was encountering in the public, state university. The postmodernism in my English class, the relativism in my sociology class, the scientific materialism in my science classes. I thought, how can I be responsible in responding to each one of these different theories? It's going to take a lifetime. So I came up with a set of principles that I've kind of extracted from my own writings. In other words, most of my own books are apologetics, but the arguments are always woven into the other topics. And I thought it would be good if I could pull out just the line of argument itself so that people could catch the argument and therefore use it for themselves in other contexts. And what's really exciting about this is that I suggest it's coming right out of Scripture. A lot of apologetics books don't have a lot of references to Scripture, but this is right out of Romans chapter 1. Most of you are theology students, and many of you, so you know that in Romans, Paul was talking to an audience he hadn't addressed before. They hadn't heard him speak, and so he is talking to people who have no theological background. They haven't heard the gospel necessarily. So he's presenting the gospel in a way that's suitable for an audience that hasn't heard it before. And where does he start? Where does Paul start his argument in Romans 1? Right? He says, we all have knowledge of God, right? This is what theologians call general revelation. The created order, which means both physical nature and human nature, give evidence of a rational personal agent. I won't read all the verses just to save time, but look at them quickly yourself, says on the slides. Okay, so how does physical nature give evidence for God? Well, because natural causes on their own are not up to the job, right, of creating the intelligible order that we see around us. I'm going to be very brief here because I think this is familiar to many of you, but just to make sure we cover all our bases. The cosmos itself is exquisitely fine-tuned. The physical constants are intricately balanced to support life. The force of gravity, the electromagnetic force, and so on. This is sometimes called the Goldilocks dilemma. How did these numerical values turn out to be not too high, not too low, but just right? What makes the question so puzzling is that there's no physical cause. As George Greenstein says, nothing in all of physics explains why its fundamental principles should conform themselves so precisely to life's requirement. And since there's no physical cause, it looks suspiciously as though they're the product of intention. As Paul Davies says, it's almost as if a grand designer had it all figured out. And neither of these are Christians. The other area where I think the evidence is particularly strong is the origin of life. And the smoking gun is the DNA code. At the heart of life is a message, information, a language. And this is why the origin of life experiments have all failed. They focus on getting a DNA molecule, the chain of chemicals. But the molecule is not the message. They're just the medium that stores and transmits the message, like the paper and ink in a book. In fact, today the most popular analogy is a computer. The DNA molecule, the chain of chemicals, is the hardware. The DNA code is the software. In fact, here's Paul Davies again. He says, attempts at chemical synthesis of life focus exclusively on the hardware, the chemical substrate of life, but they ignore the software, the informational aspect. Chemistry alone will not explain life's origin any more than a study of silicon, copper, and plastic will explain how a computer can execute a program. Okay, so that's very brief, but let's go on. These are not new ideas. Even though it's sophisticated contemporary science, these are things that the ancient world recognized as well. They knew that an intelligible universe must be the product of intelligence. Cicero, ancient Rome, when we see something moved by machinery, like an orrery or a clock or many other such things, we do not doubt that these contrivances are the work of reason. And he goes on, when therefore we behold the whole compass of the heaven moving with revolutions of marvelous velocity, executing them with perfect regularity, the annual changes of the seasons with absolute safety and security for all things, how can we doubt that all this is affected not merely by reason, but by a reason that is transcendent and divine? So just because we have modern day knowledge of DNA and cosmology and so on doesn't mean that Paul's audience didn't see the same thing. That anyone who pays attention to the created order should be able to come up with this conclusion, is what Paul's saying. Now, when Romans says the created order gives evidence for God's existence, it does not mean only the physical order, though. Most of us think of the argument from design when we read that. It also means human nature. And that's where I'm going to focus today. Humans are personal agents. And in philosophy, to say someone is personal does not mean that they're warm and friendly. To say that a conscious agent, personal being is a conscious agent who thinks, wills, and acts, in contrast to an unconscious thing or substance that operates by blind automatic forces. So Romans 1 is saying the existence of personal beings constitutes evidence for God. Why is that? Well, because personal agents cannot be the products of non-personal forces. Right? Water doesn't rise above its source. As the philosopher Étienne Gilson, that just means he's French. As Gilson says, humans are capable of thinking, so the first cause that produced them must have a mind. Humans are capable of choosing, so the first cause that created them must have a will. And as he puts it, I love this phrase, he says, because a human is a someone and not a something, the source of human life must also be a someone, not a something. So this is why it's called general revelation. These things are available to anybody in any culture, without even those who don't have the Bible. It's knowledge that's accessible to everyone. This might explain why children in every culture have a concept of God. Let me give you some of the recent findings from psychology. This is a psychologist, Paul Bloom, again, not a Christian, Yale University. He reports that when children are directly asked about the origin of animals and people, they tend to prefer explanations that involve an intentional creator, even if the adults who raised them do not. In other words, children tend to believe in God even when their parents are atheists. Psychologist Justin Barrett, who is a Christian, reports similar findings. Scientific evidence has shown that built into the natural development of children's minds is a predisposition to see the natural world as designed and purposeful, and that some kind of intelligent being is behind that purpose. Even if a group of children were put on an island and raised themselves, I think they would believe in God. So it seems that we have to be educated out of knowledge of God by secular schools and media. Okay, if general revelation is the knowledge that impinges on all human consciousness, then why don't all humans acknowledge God? What does Romans say? What does Paul say in Romans? They suppress the truth, right? We suppress what we know by general revelation. And what is the main strategy by which people suppress the knowledge of God? What's the main way they do it? Yeah. And creating idols, right? What's the nutshell definition of an idol, according to Romans? An idol is anything in the created order that's elevated to the status of the divine, right? Taking something from creation and saying, now this is the divine, this is what created us. It's turned into a god. It's deified. It's absolutized. Now, when we think of idols, we tend to think of things like golden calves or worshiping the sun. But an idol can also be something abstract, like matter. Is matter a part of the created order? Sure it is. So materialism, which says matter is the ultimate reality, qualifies as an idol by the Romans 1 definition. It says matter is the ultimate reality. It's the source and cause of everything else. It takes the place of God. What about reason? Can reason be an idol? Certainly. Rationalism puts human reason in the place of God as the source and measure of all truth. It says ultimate reality is the rational structure of the universe. Einstein called himself a believing rationalist. A believing rationalist. He said, I worship the God of Spinoza. Spinoza was a philosopher who used the word God to mean simply the rational order of the universe. So an idol is created whenever something immanent in the created order is elevated into an all-defining principle, when it's absolutized. So the upshot is that everyone is trapped in a tension, a conflict, cognitive dissonance between what they know about God from general revelation and what they profess in their idol-centered worldviews. This is the human condition. If we persist in that, what does God do next? Romans 1. He ratchets up the tension, right? He allows us to play out the negative consequences of our worldviews to see what they lead, right? He then Paul, through the rest of this chapter, then Paul runs through a series of downward steps in terms of immoral behavior, which raises an interesting question. Why do idols inevitably lead to immorality? To answer that question, you need to master one philosophical term, reductionism. Do you know what reductionism means? It means the process of reducing one level of reality down to a simpler, less complex level. It's usually in order to debunk something. Like when we've all heard people say, religion is just an emotional crutch, right? Or love is nothing but a chemical reaction. Humans are nothing but complex biochemical machines. By the way, which worldview says all three of those? Materialism, the one we already talked about. Materialism, naturalism. Right? It reduces people to purely material beings operating by material forces. So we could say that materialism redefines people in the image of matter. You see, when the Bible teaches that we're made in the image of God, that's not some obscure doctrine. It's a general principle. Your view of humanity will always be in the image of whatever you define as divine, whatever your idol is. And because an idol is always something less than God, right? It's always something in the created order. It always leads to a lower view of humanity. It will always be reductionistic. It will always be dehumanizing in some way. Those who make them will become like them, Psalm says. Every non-biblical worldview is ultimately dehumanizing. It debases and dishonors those who are made in God's image by reducing them to the image of something in the created order. So Romans 1 sums it up by saying, idols lead to a debased mind, a dehumanizing worldview. In the Greek, it's a little clearer. They became futile in their thinking. Futile means unproductive. It does not give people the fulfillment that they're looking for. And debased was a word actually that came from counterfeit money, right? Currency, a debased currency. So it means that it's not valid. It's not functioning the way it claims to. Now, when you have a low view of humanity, how are you going to treat them? How are you going to treat people? Well, you're going to treat them as less than human, right? We know this from ordinary experience. Before a soldier goes out to kill the enemy, he has to dehumanize them in his mind. Before a criminal assaults somebody, he dehumanizes the victim. So what Romans is telling us is that the debased mind leads to debased behavior. And again, the Greek is helpful here. What is not fitting, God gave them to debased mind to do what is not fitting. Fitting sounds sort of like a Jane Austen term. It's not fitting. So it's helpful to go back to the Greek. It means what does not fit with human nature. It's not congruent with who we are. An older commentary says, behavior that is not becoming the honor of human nature. Isn't that nice? So those who dishonor God end up dishonoring themselves and others. And that's why Romans 1 then leads into that long list of destructive and self-destructive behaviors. Paul is communicating a profound truth here. He's saying the reason we mistreat, oppress, abuse, and exploit people is because we have first dehumanized them in our thinking. We've reduced them to objects for our own gratification. So a reductionistic worldview leads us to treat them as less than humans made in God's image. So this is a fascinating diagnosis of non-Christian worldviews that we get from Romans 1. How can we draw an apologetic strategy out of this? If you were to take this and focus on, okay, how do we, where would we start in using this to analyze non-Christian worldviews? Just for the sake of time, I'm going to illustrate with just one worldview, naturalism or materialism, because it is the dominant worldview in the academy today, in the academic realm. In fact, it's a whole cluster of worldviews. Right? Just consider psychology, the story I told you at the beginning. There's dozens of different theories. People like Pavlov, Freud, Watson, Skinner, Erich Fromm, Albert Ellis. There's all of these theories are very different from one another, and yet they were all committed to materialism and atheism. So because of that, if materialism is fatally flawed, an entire family of theories crumbles. So let's pull out some principles here from Romans 1. How can we show how non-biblical religions or philosophies, worldviews, how can we show that they don't make the grade, that they're not true? Well, let's run through 4 principles, and then I'll illustrate with some examples. Well, first of all, identify the idol, right? If every worldview starts with non-biblical worldview starts with an idol, start by identifying the idol. What is it? What is it that is the ultimate reality, the source and cause of everything else? Think of a worldview as trying to stuff all of reality into a box. Right? For materialism, it's the box of matter. Of course, the box is never going to be big enough to explain all of reality, right? Because you're trying to explain the whole in terms of a part. You're always focusing on some part of the created order. So it's never going to be big enough. The categories will never be adequate. So something is always going to stick out of the box. Of course, if you admit that, you've admit that the worldview fails. You admit your philosophy doesn't work. So you don't admit it. Right? You take whatever doesn't fit in the box and you say, well, that's not real. That's an illusion. Okay? That's the reductionism. As soon as you say some part of reality is not real, that's the reductionism. So the next question would be, what is the reductionism in this particular worldview? Materialism reduces people to complex machines operating by blind automatic forces. They're essentially robots with no free will. Is what we all know, what all humans have access, the knowledge that all humans have access to. That provides a test for worldviews, right? A worldview has to match what we know about the world, right? If materialists say that we're machines, but does anyone really see themselves as machines, as robots? Do they treat other people as robots? We'll look at several examples again. And finally, you can show that every theory contains a logical contradiction, which it always will. Why can you be sure that it will always contain a contradiction? Again, it's because of the reductionism. Reductionism, when it's applied to the human person, is going to include the human mind, human reason, rationality. It reduces reason to something less than reason, neurons firing in the brain, for example, in contemporary neuroscience. But as soon as it undermines reason, it undermines itself, because how does it build its own case? Through reason, right. So let's run through some examples. These are the basic principles. Let me show you how that works. There's a philosopher named Galen Strawson, who is a materialist. He calls himself a metaphysical naturalist. And he does think that we're essentially robots, machines. Free will is an illusion. Okay, so free will sticks out of the box, so he decides it's just an illusion. In fact, he says, the impossibility of free will can be proved with complete certainty. Yet I can't really live with this fact from day to day. Can you really? This isn't an interview. So what's his idol? He's a metaphysical naturalist, so nature or matter is his idol. What's his reductionism? Free will is an illusion with basically robots. But does his worldview fit the real world? He himself essentially admits that humans can't really live with his worldview. Watch for phrases like that. We can't really live with it. They're a good clue that someone is bumping up against the structure of reality that we know by general revelation. You might think of this as a practical test of a worldview. Just as a scientist tests his theory by taking it into the laboratory and mixing chemicals in a test tube to see if it gets the results that the theory says it should. So you take a worldview into the world and see whether life works the way the worldview says it should. If a worldview contradicts our fundamental experience of the world, that's a pretty good sign that it's not adequate. If it fails to explain and match what we know by general revelation, then it's failed its task. Now, you might think of free will as just one question among many, but the ability to choose freely from among alternatives is what makes many of our distinctively human features. Not just moral responsibility, but creativity, originality, which means love, literature, art, love. You can't love if you're coerced. Rationality itself. If we're programmed to think a certain way, then it's not a rational decision. So many of these debates center on the reality or on free will. Is it a reality? In fact, everything around us is produced by free will, right? Who made these chairs? Who made this building? Who made our technology? The whole human world is a product of free will, free choices. So no wonder Strawson says, it seems we cannot live or experience our choices as determined, even if determinism is true. The most powerful arguments for denying free will come against the equally powerful psychological reasons why we can't help believing that we do have it. What's the key phrases again? If you can't live with it, does it fit the real world? If you can't help believing something, that's a pretty good sign that it's part of general revelation. General revelation isn't just your personal opinions or your cultural traditions and so on. It's those things that seem to be intrinsic to human nature because all people at all times and all civilizations and all periods of history have thought these things, and you can't seem to function in the world without them. And that's what Strawson is saying here. Now, how do people like Strawson respond to this? When he says, we can't live with my worldview, I mean, does he say, okay, whoops, I guess I was wrong. I guess my theory's been falsified. I guess God exists after all. No, he doesn't. Most people don't give up that easily. What does Romans 1 say they do? They suppress that knowledge, that evidence from general revelation. Materialism does not account for free will, therefore it's an illusion. It sticks out of my box, so it's not real. Reductionism is the way people suppress the truth. One way you can think about it is reductionism creates a dichotomy or a dualism. On one side are the things that fit inside the box, and that's what they call real and objective and true. And on the other side are the things that don't fit in their box, which they dismiss as a subjective illusion, a mental construct. If you've read Francis Schaeffer's books or my own books, you'll recognize this little diagram for a dualism or dichotomy. So materialists put matter and energy in the lower story. It's a metaphor of two stories in a building. In the lower story, that's what's real. And the upper story becomes a kind of attic where they toss everything that doesn't fit in the materialist box. You might say that these things are stashed away in the attic in dusty old boxes labeled superstition, wishful thinking. Educated people know better. Let me give you another example. Marvin Minsky of MIT is best known for his punchy phrase that the brain is nothing but a 3-pound computer made of meat. Now, computers don't make choices, so the implication, of course, is that free will is an illusion. And yet he too says, we cannot live with that implication. Here's how he puts it. No matter that the physical world provides no room for freedom of will, That concept is essential to our models of the mental realm. We cannot ever give it up. Thus, we're virtually forced to maintain that belief even though we know it's false. This is amazing. He's essentially admitting that he has an upper story where he puts the things that he cannot ever give up because they're essential to human experience, even though he knows, according to his worldview, that it's false. I'm focusing here on thinkers who are clear-sighted enough to recognize that their own reductionistic worldviews don't work. Most people accept ideas that sound attractive or sophisticated, but don't follow through on all the logical implications. And when we talk to them, they don't have to take our word for it. We can show them materialists who themselves admit the failure of materialism. It's good to have people like this in our minds that we can show to people and say, look, this is where materialism really leads. Let me give you another example. This is Edward Slingerland. He calls himself an evolutionist and a materialist. He also agrees, therefore, that free will is an illusion. And yet, he says, it's an illusion we can't seem to shake. No one can help acting like, and at some level really feeling, that he or she is free. In fact, he says, we are robots designed not to believe that we're robots. Designed by evolution, of course. This is another phrase to watch for when you're trying to identify general revelation. It consists of the truths that people can't help experiencing, like he says, even when it contradicts their own professed philosophy. See, when you have to assume something in order to function in the world, that's a good clue that it's part of general revelation. It's a testimony of creation that Romans is talking about. It reflects the structure of the world, either the structure of physical nature or the structure of human nature. Now, again, does he take this as a kind of falsification of his theory? Does he decide, whoops, I guess I was wrong? Watch this move. We must cultivate a dual consciousness, striving to view human beings simultaneously under two descriptions, as physical systems and as persons. So what's he doing there? Do you see the dualism, the dichotomy? He's essentially saying, I've got a lower story where people are just physical systems, and that's what I think is real. But we can't live that way. So we create this upper story of mental constructs that we don't really believe is true, but that we have to live as if it were true. And the problem, of course, is these are totally contradictory. If we're really robots operating by purely material causes, then freedom is impossible. There's no logically consistent, unified worldview that can encompass both of these statements. So in essence, people like Slingerland are taking a secular leap of faith. They're trying to find some way to acknowledge what they know is true by general revelation, what is undeniable and unavoidable in human experience, but which has no rational basis within their own worldview. You see, the strength of this form of apologetics is that it shows why worldviews fail on their own terms. Right? It's not very effective to criticize somebody else's view from within your own perspective. All that shows is that you disagree with me. Instead, Christians need to step inside the other person's perspective and show that it fails to account for reality as they themselves experience it. And the more consistently they work out the logic of their worldview, the more sharply it clashes with human experience and the wider the leap of faith. Let's stay with Slingerland here. He proposes that humans are just biochemical robots programmed for evolutionary survival. And yet, he says, the idea of my daughter as merely a complex robot for carrying my genes into the next generation is both bizarre and repugnant to me. Such extreme reductionism inspires us in us a kind of emotional resistance and even revulsion. In fact, if you don't feel that revulsion, something's wrong with you. He goes on to say, there may be individuals who lack this sense and who can quite easily conceive of themselves and other people in purely instrumental, mechanistic terms. But we label such people psychopaths and quite rightly try to identify them and put them away somewhere to protect the rest of us. Now, what can we say when someone urges us to adopt a point of view of humanity, a view of humanity that he himself admits is bizarre and repugnant, a view that ought to inspire revulsion, a view that would justify us in labeling people as psychopaths and locking them up. This is a radical dualism between what his materialism is telling him in the downstairs, the lower story, and what general revelation is telling him in the upstairs. He is clearly suppressing truths that he knows because it would falsify his theory. Now, when I teach this in the classroom, the example that my students find the most poignant is Rodney Brooks of MIT. In a book called Flesh and Machines, Brooks writes that a human being is nothing but a machine, a big bag of skin full of biomolecules interacting by the laws of physics and chemistry. Now, I know, he says, it's hard to actually see people that way. In fact, when I look at my children, when I force myself, I can see that they are machines. Is that how he actually treats them? Of course not. That's not how I treat them. I interact with them on an entirely different level. They have my unconditional love, the furthest one might be able to get from rational analysis. Well, certainly, if what counts as rational is a materialist worldview where humans are machines, then loving your own children is irrational. It has no basis within his worldview. It sticks out of his box. How does he reconcile this contradiction? Well, by the bottom line there, you can see he doesn't. I maintain two sets of inconsistent beliefs. He's given up all hope for a unified worldview. See, this is the tragedy of the postmodern age. The things that matter most in life, the things that are necessary for humane society, like freedom, moral ideals, human dignity, even loving our own children, have been reduced to nothing but useful fictions, things we know are false, as Marvin Minsky put it. Necessary falsehoods. They've been tossed in the upper story, which becomes a convenient dumping ground for anything that has no rational basis within a materialist paradigm. Our hearts should break for people whose background and education has led them to accept worldviews that are so dark, dehumanizing, demeaning, and dishonoring to the human person. And in contrast, how can we present Christianity as anything but radically positive and humane? You see, if you begin with matter operating by blind mechanical forces, then logically humans cannot ultimately be anything but complex machines. Right? Your starting assumptions limit the categories available to you. But if you begin with a transcendent personal agent, then the fact that we are personal agents makes perfect sense. The cause is capable of producing the effect. The very things that are so problematic for scientific materialism, like free will, moral responsibility, and even love, are accounted for quite logically within a Christian worldview. There's no part of human experience that falls outside the categories. Nothing that doesn't fit into the box. The box is big enough for all of human experience to fit into it. There's no upper and lower story because you don't need an attic to put things that your worldview doesn't account for. That's why Christianity still affirms the unity of truth. The truth is a coherent, logically consistent whole. In Christ, all things hold together. And it liberates us from any limited, life-denying reductionism and gives a humane view of the human person. Now, we spent a lot of time on principle 3, which is, does it fit the real world? And showing that the most sensitive of materialists recognize that it doesn't. So let's go to the principle number 4. If you were taking notes, you might remember. Number 4 was, does the worldview hold together logically? Is it internally consistent? Now, internal contradictions are going to be fatal to any system of thought, right? Because contradictory statements are necessarily false. If I say this circle is square, that's a contradiction. So it has to be false. And that's why it's a very common tactic in apologetics, right? You've all heard these. To the relativist who says there are no absolutes, are you saying there are absolutely no absolutes? To the skeptic who says we can't know anything for sure, do you know that for sure? In both cases, you see the Christian is taking a claim and turning it back on itself, showing that it undercuts itself. I know many of you know Greg Koukl, the apologist. He likes to say, this is how a philosophy commits suicide. This is how you explain it when you talk to high schoolers or junior high schoolers. You say, this is how, you don't say it's self-referentially incoherent. You say, this is how it commits suicide. When its own criteria are applied to itself, it kills itself, right? It slits its own throat. Let's run through a few examples. Marx, right? Marxism says all our beliefs are rationalizations of economic interests, okay? We adopt beliefs not because we think they're true, but because they help us get ahead economically. What about Marx's beliefs then? Are they true or just rationalizations of economic interests? Right? The philosophy undercuts itself. Nietzsche, the philosopher who said all human action is driven by the will to power. Ideas are used to dominate. Is that why you hold your theory, Nietzsche? So his theory undercuts itself. Freud, all beliefs are products of a person's unconscious emotional needs and especially sexual repression. What about your own theory? On the couch yourself, Dr. Freud. Postmodernism, human rationality is swamped by non-rational social forces like race, class, and gender. What about your own theory then? It commits suicide. Evolutionary psychology, ideas arise in our brains not because of their truth value, but their survival value. Apply that theory to itself, then it's not true either, but only a matter of survival. So finding internal contradictions like this has always been a standard tool in any apologetics toolbox. What's unique about the apologetic method that I've outlined here is it shows you why. It explains why this works. It's not just a little rhetorical trick. It's not just a way to some people have seen it as just sort of a parlor trick, a rhetorical trick to make fun of other people's beliefs. It's not. Again, the key is a reductionism. Romans 1 teaches an idol is always something in the created order, right? Something less than God. So human beings made in God's image will always also be reduced to something less than the full humanity, and that will include the human mind, human reason, rationality. So reductionistic worldviews are always going to reduce human rationality to some non-rational force, right? Whether economic interest, will to power, sexual repression, or whatever. See that? So but if ideas are not the product of reason, that rule has to apply to all ideas, including one's own theory. So the debunkers end up debunking themselves. And the only escape for the debunkers is to exempt themselves, right, from the reductionist categories that they use to debunk everybody else. Right? So they have to say, oh, no, I'm not blinded by the same irrational forces that everybody else is. You know, Marx says, I'm not bound by my economic interests. You know, postmodernists say, no, I'm not a product of my race, class, and gender. Somehow they are able to mysteriously rise above the forces that enslave everybody else and see truth as it really is. Even though they stuff the entire universe into a box, they themselves aren't trapped in the box. Strangely enough, they're able to float above the box and offer theories that are objectively true. But of course, by making an exemption for themselves, they've introduced a logical inconsistency into their worldview. So either way, the idol-based worldview contains a contradiction. Christianity doesn't have this problem, right? Because the Bible teaches that a rational God made the world with a rational order and created humans in his image to function within that order. So there's a congruence between the structure of the world and the structure of human cognition, a correlation between subject and object in the act of knowledge. Whereas Alvin Plantinga puts it, God created both us and our world in such a way that there's a certain fit or match between the world and our cognitive faculties. So this is a basis for a Christian or biblical epistemology, epistemology meaning a theory of knowledge. So what does that mean? It means that all other philosophies have to assume a Christian epistemology, right? They have to assume the reliability of reason and rationality, at least when they're making their own claims. Otherwise, they commit suicide. They have to borrow, if their own philosophy doesn't give them an adequate epistemology, so they have to reach over and borrow one from Christianity, even as they deny Christianity is true. No wonder Paul says in Romans 1, he's not ashamed of the gospel. What gives him that courage? It's from knowing that Christianity has greater explanatory power than any other worldview or religion. It leads to a far more humane and liberating view of the human person. In Romans 1, Paul has given us a basic template for apologetics that we can use with any theory, any worldview we encounter, so that we too can be confident that biblical truth is not just religious truth. If I can borrow the title of my earlier book, it is total truth. Total truth gives us the intellectual resources to explain all of creation. And yet we should never just treat apologetics as a matter of working out what other people believe, right? In the process, we first need to face the possibility that we too harbor mental idols, right? We're all sinners. We're all fallen. We're all in a process of sanctification. We all struggle to put God first in our lives. That's why genuine intellectual growth happens only in the context of sanctification. I like to think of it as sanctification of the mind. It begins with repentance, with a commitment to turn from intellectual idols and to allow God to define what counts as true all across the board. We must be utterly convinced that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, not just spiritual wisdom, not just religious wisdom, but all wisdom. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Romans 12. The only way to recover a unified worldview is to root out every mental idol in our own thinking. So learning apologetics is not just for the purpose of evangelism. Oops, sorry, I forgot that one. There's Paul saying, I'm not ashamed, and apologetics is not just for the purpose of evangelism. It also serves our own sanctification and growth in grace. The ultimate goal of worldview studies is to love God more authentically, worship Him more fully, to love God with all your mind. And you may be surprised by joy, as C.S. Lewis was, surprised by joy when you discover that God's truth really is resilient enough, bright enough, all-encompassing enough to be a light to all our paths, to illuminate every area of life. Thank you very much.
Right, if you have questions, come up to the mic and ask your questions.
Pretty straightforward.
Hi. You're talking about Christian epistemology. Is that the only epistemology that believes in the reliability of reason and rationality?
Well, philosophers like Dr. Grotius can help us with this. But as I looked at Romans 1, and I thought, okay, every worldview has an idol. It takes something in the created world and elevates it to an idol. It elevates one thing to the place of God, and it denigrates everything else. Right? That's the reductionism. When one thing is deified, everything else will be denigrated. Well, what's the worldview that deifies reason? Rationalism. So there would be one worldview that's an exception to the, I think that, now I'm not sure, rationalism has other problems, but it doesn't denigrate reason. So that would be the one exception. But everything else, yes, every other worldview would denigrate reason because something else is put in the place of God, and therefore human beings, including human rationality, will be reduced to something less. I mean, if Romans 1 is right, if you take Romans 1 at its word, every other it takes a while to think this through, doesn't it? Every other worldview is going to start with something in the created order, something less than God. I mean, what else is there? There's God, and there's the created order. So if you don't worship God, you're going to take something in the created order and make that your deity.
A major part of your argument was that free will is kind of a chink in the armor, so to speak, of some of these major arguments. But there are a lot of Christians that would at least, to an extent, deny free will or limit it. How would you deal with that, since that's also an issue in Christianity, not just atheism?
Sure. I was raised Lutheran. Luther wrote The Bondage of the Will. And then I became Presbyterian after going to L'Abri. Calvin, predestination. But both Luther and Calvin, and I have a great quote from Alvin Planting on this if you want to press me on it. Both Luther, and he's my appeal to authority here. Both Luther and Calvin were adamant that we contribute nothing to salvation. Right? They're arguing against the medieval notion of merit, right? That somehow we can earn our salvation, we can contribute to our salvation. They were both adamant that we contribute nothing to salvation, it is a gift. But neither of them thought you can't decide whether to have ham or turkey on your sandwich for lunch. None of them thought that we are robots in the way that modern secular materialism does. None of them thought we are meat machines. Remember Marvin Minsky, where the human mind is a 3-pound computer made of meat. None of them had this reductionistic view of the human person, that we have no free will. In fact, like I said, did I say this at the beginning? I became a Christian at L'Abri, and Schaeffer used to argue that, it was one of his strongest arguments, that we're made in God's image, we have free will, we have human dignity, moral responsibility, and so on, over against the secular worldviews that are all very deterministic and reductionistic. So I think that's the distinction. I think we can hold strong on the Protestant distinctive there over against traditional Catholicism, that we don't contribute anything to salvation. But we're not machines. We're not robots. We stand for human dignity and human significance and a high view of the human person because we're made in God's image.
Thanks.
Following the outline of your argument from Romans 1 and looking at Paul's evidence of the reprobate mind of sexual immorality, what do you think the significance is today in our society as we've got increasing legalization of same-sex marriage to the validity of these various worldviews that you talked about?
Yeah, well, I am going to talk about that more tonight, so I don't want to go into great detail. But I think what happens when we read Romans 1 is we kind of go quickly from the beginning to we jump quickly to the moral implications, right? And so I wanted to make sure that we stop and say, no, there's a mental, worldview shift that happens first, and the behavior follows the worldview shift. And I think when we see what's happening in our culture today, it's the worldview shift that precedes the moral shift. And typically you can't argue with people on the moral basis alone, because your morality is derivative of your worldview. Your morality depends on who you think the human person is. What is a proper way for humans to behave? What's a proper way for me to treat a human? I treat a human differently from a cat. Why? Because a human is a different kind of, has a different nature. That's where natural law ethics comes from. We have a different nature, and you treat people according to their nature. So it's more effective generally to go behind the moral issues and argue the worldview. And that's what I'll do tonight.
How would you respond to someone whose worldview says, yes, there is indeed a God, but this God goes by many names, and we're all part of this God, and that's why we respond the way we do, because we have God within us, and we're responding to that in sort of a universal entity. We're all connected.
Sure, pantheism. See, this is where you guys we need to work this out, because this is a very new presentation I have, so I'm interested in your responses. In every worldview, you have to figure out what the idol is. So what's the idol? Now, you're talking about pantheism, to give it a label. You're talking about pantheism. Pantheism says the universe is God. The universe is in pure pantheism, the material universe isn't even real, right? It's an illusion, Maya, right? In traditional Hinduism, M-A-Y-A, which means illusion. Your separate existence is an illusion. Because the reality is that you're part of this universal spiritual substance. And of course, the weakness of pantheism is it's a non-personal substance. Right? We started out by saying you can't explain personal beings with a non-personal beginning. Many people misunderstand pantheism. They think it's kind of like the Christian view of God being immanent, and so they think of it as a personal God. But in classic pantheism, it's not a personal God. It's much more, it's a non-cognitive, non-thinking, non-feeling, non-acting substance or essence. So just as materialism says everything is made out of material stuff, pantheism says, no, everything's made of spiritual stuff. But it's still just stuff, it's still a non-personal substance. So it still does not account for human personality. It still does not, and that's why in pantheism, what's the goal? What's the goal of meditation? To get rid of your individual personality, to merge with the void. There's I think it was 8th, 9th century Chinese poet that you find this poem frequently in anthologies on nature, and unfortunately I found it in an anthology by a Christian poet who obviously didn't recognize the pantheism in it. That's where I first saw it, in fact. And I thought, why is he including this pantheistic poem? He's not recognizing it. And then I researched it, and I found that it's very common. Anyway, it's by Li Po, and it ends with it talks about somebody sitting, meditating on the side of a mountain. And it ends, and the evening is falling, and it ends with these lines. We sit together, the mountain and I, until only the mountain remains. I thought, what a view of dissolving the human personality, disillusion. What he's saying is your personal identity is an illusion and has so little value that it ought to just dissolve into the mountainside. It should dissolve into the one. The mountain represented, in a sense, the one, the eternal, infinite, spiritual substance. What a dehumanizing worldview. You have so little value that you shouldn't even remain a separate individual. You should just dissolve into the mountainside.
Thank you.
What would you say to the argument that says that love is basically the evolutionary product to ensure the safety of young and passing on of genes?
Well, I might quote Slingerland. That's what he said. Do you remember? He's the one who said, to see my daughter is just a robot for passing my genes to the next generation is bizarre and repugnant to me. I think what you're seeing in him is, he essentially says, I can't operate with that kind of worldview. It doesn't fit who we really are. Remember, it's the logical implication of a worldview. The person who says that has already decided that a form of materialistic evolution is true, and this is one of the consequences. So I would argue it on the basis of the fundamental questions of, is evolution really true? Are natural causes up to the job? I would go to the foundation of the worldview and argue it there. But, Slingerland also gives you an avenue of saying, well, let's compare that to the way we really function. Can you really treat your daughter as if she's just a vehicle for passing your genes to the next generation? Nobody can live with that kind of a worldview. And I think that's a proper test for worldview. Can you live with it? Can you take it into the real world? When you take it into the real world, do you keep bumping your shins against reality? Or if you think of people talk about a worldview being kind of like a mental map, right? If this is a mental map, do you keep falling off cliffs? If so, your map is, something wrong with your map. So I think that so you can kind of think of it as a proper pragmatism within Christianity. The pragmatic test of a worldview is, can you live in the real world with it? And nobody really lives that way.
Thank you.
When presenting a reality, you take on the burden of proof, and you presented several of them that they said they couldn't live. They failed the test of livability. How are they still considered authorities in their area, or still considered authorities when they present a worldview that is not livable?
That's a good question. I'll just answer with an anecdote. I gave a presentation once, and unbeknownst to me, there was a Harvard physics professor in the audience. And afterwards, he came up to me, and I gave a few of these examples. He came up to me very upset, and he said, some of them were his Harvard colleagues. I quoted Steven Pinker, for example. At any rate, so these were his colleagues. And he came up very angry and he said, these guys know that their theories don't fit the real world outside of the lab, so why throw it in their faces? That was an odd response. First of all, it was, had he vindicated what I said? They know their theories don't work outside the lab? That's what he said. And then he said, don't throw it in their faces. And I thought that was really sad that he would see apologetics as a way of throwing it in their faces, because that's obviously not the goal. Right. The goal is to help people realize that there's a way to test your worldview, and we all should, it's an us, it's not an us-them thing, it's us-us. We always need to be testing our ideas, too, against the real world. We should always be testing Christianity. We should always be open to it being falsified. That's right? We should always be open to it. That's part of being a free thinker. We should be the free thinkers in the world. We're not afraid of testing ideas. But I think it's a reminder that when we do apologetics, we don't act like we're throwing it in their faces. That we do make sure that the tone and the approach that we take with people is deep compassion for people who are trapped in dehumanizing, dark worldviews that are dishonoring to the human person, that we come across as caring about them and offering them a worldview that fulfills their own deepest aspirations. When Slingerland says, I can't treat my kids this way, or when Rodney Brooks says, I can't see my kids this way, we say, well, look, we'll give you a worldview that makes sense of that, that will affirm and support your deepest desires and your deepest aspirations and your most human impulses. We will show you there is a rational basis for that. You don't have to throw it up in the attic as a human construct that somehow, is an illusion that we have to live with. No, it is real. It's real, and we can give you a basis for it, and there's a real personal God to give it a basis. So, we should have this loving, positive approach. How can we not? Christianity is so wonderful. How can we not have a loving, compassionate approach? Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that great talk, Dr. Pearcey. And so now it is time to adjourn for lunch. I checked the Facebook page for the cafeteria. They say they have jambalaya and chicken fried steak. So if you're not in the meal plan, it's really great food. You can go purchase it. And pick up your student center maps to figure out where the rooms are. They're in the foyer area.